question is, if traffic is so hateful, why do rich people drive more? And it's a fact, as it turns out, that higher income households make more trips and travel more miles than lower income households, and that this is a meaningful why do rich people drive more. And it's not just, this isn't really about rich versus poor. I mean, that's just a sort of dramatized. As it turns out, it's really about that higher income households make more trips and travel more miles than lower income households. This is a reminder, this is why do rich people drive more. And it's not just, really about rich travel value goods. As it turns out, it's really about that higher income households like other value goods and travel more miles. And this is a reminder, it's not just, really about travel value. That is something that would argue about
Conservative and liberal. Now, the division that I'm seeing and that troubles me is between those of us who, faced with these extraordinary changes that we're living every day, think that the best way to deal with it, to protect ourselves, to defend ourselves, is to do exactly that, to get down into something of a defensive crouch, to protect ourselves from these relentless forces of change. And it's very, very understandable. Those of us who believe that we somehow have to stay open and connected and try to shape these forces of change to our benefit, or at least mitigate their downsides. In other words, if I was going to put an image on it, the division and the difference that we're experiencing almost every day is between those who believe that the future is best secured by building a wall and those who believe we're better off building bridges. And as I've thought about it, it seems to me that three broad trends have brought us to this moment and to this division. First, the sheer pace and scope of change, fueled by technology, the unbridled flow of information, the sense that borders are eroding, that's created among so many of our fellow citizens a sense of chaos, confusion, vulnerability, a loss of control, and so a desire for order. Second, another trend, and it's a bit of a paradox. If you look in the aggregate, if you step back and look at virtually every metric we can think of, we've actually never been better off. We're healthier, we're wealthier, we're wiser, we're more secure, we're more tolerant than we have ever been in our history. And yet, globalization, automation, demographics have produced a very uneven distribution of that progress, all of which was exacerbated by the financial crisis in 2008. And that, in turn, adds anger, fear, and resentment to the mix for those who don't feel that they're part of this progress. You can almost visualize this in two very starkly different statistics. On the one hand, over the last few decades, we have seen an extraordinary, dramatic decline in poverty and extreme poverty around the world. We've gone from 20 years ago, 2/3 of the world's population living on $5.50 or less a day, to now just under 50% of the world's population living in poverty. The reduction in extreme poverty even greater. That's people living at $1.90 or less a day. 20 years ago, 30% of the world's population. Today, 11%. But on the other hand, income inequality is rising. The 7 million richest people in the world, in other words, 0.1% of the population, took home 13.8% of all economic growth since 1980. That's the same as the poorest 50%, 3.8 billion people took home during the same time period. By 2050, that top 0.1% will own more wealth than the entire global middle class. And of course, we've seen jobs rebound, and that's a wonderful thing. But the issue in some sense is less job quantity and more job quality, with wages that are too low to sustain a middle-class lifestyle. So the result of these first two trends, this pace and scope of change creating a sense of chaos and confusion, and then this paradox of so much progress, but also too many people who don't feel a part of it, is a growing group of people who feel left out and left behind. For some, it's economic. But for others, it's cultural, a loss of social status, a loss of identity, particularly among white working-class men. The world that they knew is slipping away. They tend to blame elites, for benefiting from all of this progress while ignoring the negative economic and social effects it was having on their fellow citizens. And then finally, a third trend that I think explains how we got to this moment. And that has to do with extraordinary power shifts, not just among countries, but in a sense, below, beneath, between them. We see rising new powers. Nothing better illustrates this than China. But also corporate chieftains, the mayors of megacities, super-empowered groups and individuals, fueled by information and technology, all new actors who have a greater ability than ever before to veto the outcomes that a national government or an international organization is trying to advance. Democracy's comparative advantage is also slipping. A renowned scholar of democracy, J.R. Ewing, some of you will remember him, he was a citizen of Dallas, actually said, and this is Larry Hagman, the actor, and it was almost demonstrable. Back in the 1980s, when Dallas was on TV, it was broadcast around the world. And people saw this extraordinary wealth and success in our country. They wanted the same thing, and they thought that in order to get it, they had to emulate our political system as well as our economic one. It actually proved to be a great selling tool for democracy. We're now at a point very soon where non-free countries around the world will generate more than 50% of global income. So all of a sudden, they have an attraction, and you don't have to necessarily follow democracy to get what they've got. And of course, all of this has been exacerbated by the almost relentless political paralysis that we see in Washington, extreme partisanship, and a sense that our politics is profoundly corrupt. And internationally, the failures of international organizations of one kind or another have also fed this sense of a lack of credibility and erosion of trust. Authoritarians sometimes seem to deliver more to their people more effectively, more efficiently than we do. And so the net of this is that it's harder for traditional institutions, for a national government, for an international organization, to get things done, to deliver results. There's a crisis of confidence in our institutions, which increasingly have been delegitimized. If you put all of that together, if you put these three broad trends together, it almost creates a perfect storm. And, in my judgment at least, explains in part the emergence, or actually more accurately, the reemergence of nationalism, protectionism, xenophobia, and isolationism. People looking for answers in these confusing times respond to strength, and they find comfort in tribes. Those who believe that we should build walls can play on understandable popular concerns. And in this environment, all of a sudden, a refugee is a threat to your security, an immigrant a threat to your identity, a trade deal a threat to your job. International organizations, our engagement abroad, becomes more of a burden than a benefit, and especially after a decade, more than a decade, of two wars with a massive deployment of U.S. troops to Iraq and Afghanistan. We get entangled in other people's problems. There are a bunch of free riders. We'd better focus at home instead. And so we have this moment where there's a rejection of free trade, of immigration, of globalization, of engagement in alliances and international organizations, and a tug of war between an open, connected world where we try to get win-win outcomes for all the participants, and a more closed, Hobbesian world that's increasingly zero-sum. Now, most of you know very well that this is not a new debate. We've had it before. But it's very useful to recall some of the lessons we learned from history. After all, those who forget history are condemned to retweet it. After World War I, we retreated, despite the best efforts of President Wilson. We rejected participation in the League of Nations. There was an economic crisis. We became protectionist. The rise of dictators in Europe. We became isolationist. The result, in part, a global depression, a world war, a genocide. And then after World War II, we got something that is incredibly rare in life, not to mention in international relations. We got a do-over. And we faced a similar choice. We could come home, as we did after World War I. Or we could impose our will on others. We had emerged from World War II as by far the greatest world power. All of the other countries that might compete with us were suffering the ravages of war. Or we could do what we did, which is to shape a new international system with rules, norms, institutions that gave others a voice and a vote, and that bound us to those same rules and norms. It enabled us to spread liberal values like representative government and human rights, and liberal concepts like non-aggression and self-determination, the peaceful settlement of disputes. And it led to the creation of a more open, connected world with increasingly free movement of people, ideas, products, and capital. Now, in many ways, leading for that kind of world seemed counterintuitive. I mean, after all, we constrained our own power by binding ourselves to these rules. But it turned out to be a masterstroke, because it took away an incentive that we've seen throughout history when one country rises more powerfully than others, for other countries to get together, to bandwagon, to try to check the rising powers' authority and power. And it created a win-win international system in which the strength and success of others also benefited us. And it's what we came to call enlightened self-interest. By investing in the security and prosperity of others, we got a return on that investment 10, 100, 1,000 times over. New markets for our products, new allies to deter aggression or to fight with us if we had to fight, and new partners to deal with increasingly global challenges. Now, I'd be the first to acknowledge that that system, in reality, often fell far short of its ideals. Colonialism, apartheid, lasted for many, many decades. In Southeast Asia, in Latin America, certainly our foreign policy showed a gap between ideals and reality. Civil wars, proxy conflicts endured, and we had a very inconsistent approach that we continue to this day in how to deal with dictators. If they were our dictators, we gave them a pass. If they weren't, we took them to the woodshed. But overall, I think it's fair to say that we got the big picture right. There was no more war among the great powers. Democracies tend not to go to war with one another. We were on a hair trigger for decades, but the Cold War ended peacefully. And the openness, the predictability, the stability that this system created allowed the emergence of other countries with hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty into a global middle class. And when you actually look at it, what's called the rise of the rest has been the largest force for powering world economics and sustained economic growth. And so overall, we got it right. Now, my own conviction is that this new reemergence of nationalism, and protectionism, and isolationism and xenophobia ultimately will fail. And indeed, instead of building a wall, its proponents are likely to run into one, and that's reality. This approach of building walls, I think, underestimates the risk of turning inward. It overstates the costs. It downplays the benefits of remaining engaged. A disengaged, hunkered-down America, a zero-sum policy, will leave us worse off. And I think of it this way. First, doing that would ultimately deny us the partnerships that we need to confront challenges that are beyond the capacity of any one nation or the ability of any single wall to contain. Just think about some of the really big challenges that we're facing around the world. Epidemics that defy frontiers. Ebola breaks out halfway around the world, it can threaten us here. No wall is going to keep it out. Hackers who leap firewalls. Halfway around the world, someone can press a button, and our critical infrastructure may be targeted and endangered. terrorists who form global networks. Think only of Al-Qaeda or more recently ISIL. Drug cartels that find gaps in the wall, the opioid crisis, driven in large part by heroin coming in from Mexico and synthetic fentanyl coming all the way from China. Aggressors who ignore borders, like Russia did in Ukraine. Rogue actors who amass intercontinental arsenals, like North Korea. Refugees from half a world away who land on our shores. And of course, an ocean that rises and a planet that warms. Each and every one of these challenges simply cannot be solved by the United States acting in isolation, acting alone, or building a wall. It can't happen. And then a lesson that I took from my time in government. The world is not self-organizing. If we're not part of leading it, then one of two things. Either someone else will do it, and probably not to our interests and values, or in some ways even worse, no one does it. And then we have chaos and a vacuum that tends to get filled by malevolent forces before it's filled by good ones. And then going forward, as I think about the years to come, it seems to me that virtually every group in our country will need and depend on U.S. leadership around the world and our global engagement. Our workers, our companies, they will need U.S. global economic leadership to level playing fields for our products and to reach the 95% of the world's consumers who don't happen to live in the United States. And also to set the highest standards for protecting workers, preserving the environment, protecting intellectual property. Our soldiers and our diplomats, they will continue to depend on us maintaining an unrivaled and unique system and network of alliances, voluntary alliances, unique in the world, both to deter conflicts or to make us more effective and legitimate when we have to fight. All of our citizens benefit in ways big and small from our engagement in international institutions that work every single day to try to help keep the peace, prevent the spread of weapons, protect the environment, defend human rights, and develop new norms from outer space to cyberspace. The UN, for good reason, is much criticized. There seems to be a scandal every other week. Money is ill spent. It needs reform. But it also needs preserving. A couple of quick examples. Peacekeeping operations. There are about 100,000 peacekeepers under those UN blue hats serving around the world. Do you know how many are American? Fewer than 100. That's a pretty good deal, because if they weren't doing it, we'd have to do it, or no one would do it, and crises would become even worse and would probably wind up in some way on our shores. Every year, the UN system is providing food to 90 million people in 73 countries. It vaccinates nearly 60% of the world's children, saving 2.5 million lives every year, provides assistance to more than 30 million refugees, promotes maternal health, saving the lives of 30 million women every year around the world, and works to advance democracy, assisting countries with elections. So our engagement, our participation, our leadership to try and make that system work more effectively is profoundly in our interest. Our communities, our businesses will draw energy and vitality by including new Americans through a secure but also welcoming immigration system. When I look at the entire spectrum of activity in this country, I see every single day what new arrivals to our shores are doing to make this country great. Picking our crops, cleaning our rooms, making and serving our food, nursing our sick, doctoring underserved communities. And then at the other end of the spectrum, 40% of Fortune 500 companies founded or co-founded by immigrants. 50% of the Silicon Valley startups founded or co-founded by immigrants. And the hard fact is, new arrivals as compared to the native-born commit fewer crimes, they're more religious, they're better educated, they're more entrepreneurial. They're a profound positive addition to this country. And finally, Finally, our children will find opportunity as long as America continues its global leadership in innovation, science, and technology. So, thinking about this, logically, it seems to me that the case for the bridge builders remains a strong one. The lessons of history teach us that. The imperatives of the present, the demands of the future, all argue in the same direction. And we see, to some extent, the administration now bending to some of these realities, but also still a very strong strain of nationalism and populism. And in Europe, yes, populist, nationalist movements seem to have fallen just short of the goal line in a lot of recent elections. The Netherlands, France, Germany. But Austria, Hungary, Poland, Italy, they've moved in another direction. And the steady growth of populism in Europe over the last 25 years is continuing. So, what is to be done from where I sit for all of this? Let me suggest a few things. And it's pretty simple on one level. I think anyone responsible for shaping the policies of this country in the direction it takes needs to do three things: listen, defend, and amend. Listen. Listen to those among us who feel left out or left behind. I mean, after all, it's not really progress if too many of our fellow citizens don't benefit and don't feel it. For someone like me who spent most of his time on the East Coast, getting out of the East Coast or the West Coast is a pretty good place to start. Dialogue, conversation, not monologues, are usually important. And for those working in government, I don't think we need to show that we can solve every problem. We just need to show that we understand there's a problem. Defend. History. 5-point plans. Facts. They're still important, but they're not enough. One of the things that really struck me working in government was the impact of stories, of narrative. The ability to move people is much greater with a story than it is with a 5-point fact sheet. Some of you will remember this. A few years ago, at the height of the global refugee crisis, there was a photograph that went around the world, and it showed a young Syrian child who had drowned being carried to shore by a Turkish soldier. When that photograph went around the world, I was working in the Obama administration, we were inundated with messages, with phone calls, with newspaper articles, with people going on TV saying, open the doors, let everyone in, bring every Syrian into the United States. We can't accept this. A few weeks later, there was a terrorist attack in San Bernardino. Now, it had nothing to do with a refugee or an immigrant, but the tide of messages and traffic that came into the White House and the State Department moved in exactly the opposite direction. Put up the drawbridge. Don't let anyone in. So the power of these kinds of stories and images to move things is dramatic, and capturing that is a very, very important thing. And finally, let me say that when it comes to defending, we have to do a much better job. Those of us in a foreign policy racket have to do a much better job connecting these abstract foreign policy principles and concepts to real lives, both foreign and domestic. It has to start with acknowledging the downsides and the fears that come from certain policies, not to dismiss, not to minimize, not to patronize. Those of us who believe in free trade have to acknowledge the drivers of unemployment, like automation, like a lack of flexibility in the economy, like the transition that may come from a free trade agreement. Those of us who believe we have to combat climate change also have to speak to coal miners who may be losing their job as a result of some of the things we have to do to move in that direction. Those of us who believe America should remain welcoming to refugees and to migrants have to speak to the fears of terrorism and, maybe more particularly, a loss of identity. And finally, amend. How do we navigate a whole series of great migrations of our time? It's not just people moving around the planet, it's products, which brings good things and bad things. It's ideas and information. Those migrations bring good things and bad things. It's capital. That migration brings good things and bad things. Effective integration of new arrivals, fairer trade, making sure that creative disruption in Silicon Valley isn't destruction of people's livelihoods and futures, making sure that the quality of information matches the quantity of information we now receive every day, and then sharing burdens around the world so that when we're engaged, we know that others are doing their fair share. All of those things are going to happen more effectively than they have if we're going to sustain support for an open, connected America. And then finally, I want to leave you with this. Maybe the most important thing of all is to invest in our human resources. You know, if we were in this room talking together 40, 50, 60 years ago, and the question on the table for all of us was, how would you define the wealth of a nation? I think the answer that you'd get coming out of this room would be, well, the best way to measure whether a nation's wealthy is how big is its population? How great is its landmass? What about its abundance of natural resources? Or maybe the strength of its military? And all of those measures are still important. And the good news is, as Americans, we have an abundance of all of them. But I think the answer to that question today, how do you really measure the wealth of a nation, goes to its human resources and the ability of a given country to maximize them to their full potential. If you're able to do that, even if you are devoid of some of those other measures of wealth, you're going to do very well in the 21st century. So that has to be our number one objective. And in a funny way, just to go back for a moment to history, it's a little bit what we did on the plus side after World War I and then certainly after World War II. The investments that we made in building this infamous liberal international order, the international system, they were matched, those investments, by investments we made in our people here at home. We had the best educated people on this planet. From 1910 to 1940, the percentage of American teens in high school went from 18% to 71%. And at that same time, it was about 20% in Europe. That was an extraordinary foundation for post-war growth after World War II. College enrollment went up 50% between 1939 and 1946. And of course, the GI Bill, which paid tuition and gave people a stipend equal to about 70% of the minimum wage, was a remarkable catalyst for progress and growth. By the way, 50% of people who benefited from the GI Bill went on to start a new business at some point in their lives. U.S. research universities, like this one, multiplied. States invested in their public universities. Federally funded basic research and the private sector worked together to drive the application of new products and new ideas and deploying new discoveries. We made investments in infrastructure and housing, which created much greater labor mobility. Wage growth actually tracked productivity. The U.S. workforce was the wealthiest and the best educated in the world. Now it barely cracks the top 20. So, what is to be done? There are all sorts of interesting policy ideas out there. And you'll notice that I've been talking about the international environment and the world, but I'm profoundly convinced that our ability to operate and act and lead in the world depends on the strength of the foundation that we build at home. And it basically comes down to making sure that we're investing in our own people so that they're equipped to succeed in a globalized world and to weather some of the challenges that it poses through the disruption that it creates. So, reducing the cost of college, focusing more on two-year and community college, apprenticeships, maintaining, and I would say increasing federal funding in basic science and research, tax credits for companies that invest in worker skills, revamping the transition assistance we give to people displaced by a trade deal. Some people talk about a guaranteed basic income. There's a big debate about that. It's worth having. Maybe even some kind of guaranteed job is better, because at the end of the day, a job is more than a paycheck. It's fundamentally about your dignity. And that's really what people are looking for. Affordable housing, child care tax credits, health care, infrastructure. All of these things are the ways we can move forward to make sure that our people, our human resources, can fulfill their potential. And so it seems to me that we're at an inflection point, as we've been in the past. And just as capitalism was saved by the Progressive Era and later the New Deal, American-led internationalism needs explaining, it needs defending, it needs amending if it's going to survive, and if our future is to be shaped not by walls, but by bridges. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions or any comments, for that matter, on what you just heard. And if you've got a question or a comment, please feel free to come to the side. I think there are microphones on either side.
So I'm a graduate student here. I'm studying political science. One of the things that you mentioned several times in your lecture was that working class white men are being left out, and those who are supportive of immigration and policies have to speak to that loss of identity. I struggle as an instructor of color on this campus to be sympathetic to, as an Indigenous woman, being sympathetic, and I try to include opposite narratives, but can you please speak to what we can do to address this loss of identity and...
Yeah, no, I hear you. Listen, I hear you very much, and it's really hard stuff. I mean, if you're part of a group that's never been at the table until recently, it's kind of hard to identify with people who've been at the head of the table,
Right.
And who suddenly feel like, hey, wait a minute, what's going on? So that makes a lot of sense.
I mean, I believe in engaging my students, and I try to play the bridge builder, but the loss of identity, I think, is seen as a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty I feel it's
Yeah,
consistent.
you put your finger on it, and that's getting out of the zero-sum mindset is the hardest thing to do. And the hard thing to do is demonstrate that actually somehow this can be a win-win. But I've seen so many examples of it. I mean, one of the really interesting things is, and actually when you look at some of the academic studies of this, communities that are most resistant to immigration tend to be communities that are one town removed from the towns that are actually getting new migrants. And there's almost this fear that builds up. And once people are actually confronted with the reality of new neighbors, many of whom, by the way, go on to revitalize communities that thought their better days were behind them, it's a different story. But there's no simple fix for this, except to do what you're trying to do, and I know how hard it is, which is to actually try and get people together and genuinely listen and genuinely try and understand how someone feels that their world is changing on them, and to try to demystify that and work through it. But I'd be the first to say this is just not easy stuff, and it demands, in a way, that we all act bigger than ourselves. We're all human. We all find appeals to the lesser angels of our nature, and we have to make a huge effort for the better angels to prevail. So keep at it. I wish there was a magic answer. All I can tell you is, if we don't do it, we're going to be in trouble. Anyone over there?
How's it going, Mr. Blinken?
Good, thank you.
I just want to thank you for being here. I just have a question more about nationalism. Do you think there's any, I guess, healthy level, more like a civic nationalism, where we can still, I guess, maintain our identity as a nation?
Yes.
But also work together on a global scale and work with each other.
And it's really called patriotism. It's a wonderful and powerful thing. But so it's a wonderful way to make people feel empowered and part of a community. But it really depends on how you define it. If it becomes us versus them, even within our own community, that's not a great way to define it. But no, I'm a strong believer in patriotism. And there's a cohesive force that comes with that kind of nationalism. That's a good thing. But when it's taken to the point that all of a sudden everything is a zero-sum game, that becomes a losing game pretty quickly for everyone. So I think the trick is to hang on to it, to hang on to these ways of feeling like you're connected to your fellow citizens, but to do it in a way that acknowledges that we can actually have win-win outcomes, that we can do deals and agreements with others where they get something out of it and we get something out of it. It doesn't have to be zero-sum. And of course, getting that balance right isn't easy. But when nationalism is taken to an extreme, we've seen in history where that tends to lead. So you have to have some kind of check on it. I'm not talking about global government. That's not the deal. And all of us want to retain the ability to run our own lives, to shape our own destinies. But that's one thing. It's another thing to say, we're not cooperating, we're not coordinating, we're not working together to try to deal with what are fundamentally common challenges. Everything I talked about earlier, that has an impact on countries around the world. If we can't work on these issues together, then we're all going to hang alone.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so this is a tiny bit verbose. I cut out about 2/3 of it. So, okay, so I strongly agree that we need self-organizing and appreciate your 3 points. But my question is essentially, can we actually meaningfully self-organize apart from a bottom-up movement of the radical left? Is it possible to protect workers, humanity, immigrants, and the environment without a clearly left, critical of capitalism, anti-0.01% movement like Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? Wrapping it up here, how can we get the 0.01% to invest in humanity such as education, healthcare, when they have so much influence over the political process, and how can we get people to believe they can actually make a difference?
Yeah. Look, I think you've given expression to something that's incredibly powerful and palpable in the country. And, you know, if you go back again and look at history and look at the progressive era, look at the New Deal, we adopted policies for the express purpose of saving capitalism from its own excesses. And so, anti-monopoly, new taxes to break up concentrations of wealth. All of those things made a powerful impact, I think, when you read history, in making sure that we would not only survive, but thrive, and that the wealth would be somewhat more evenly distributed. And I suspect we're at another moment where we really have to think hard about those kinds of policies. Now, I will acknowledge to you, I'm probably in the centrist camp of the Democratic Party. And I think you can actually, again, I keep coming back to win-wins. I think you can do it. Here's an example. The Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement was basically maligned by everyone. President Trump, of course, rejected it once he came to office, but when Hillary Clinton was a candidate, even though she had been, in a sense, at the origin of the agreement when she was Secretary of State, she also turned on it. Now, I happen to think that was a huge mistake for a number of reasons, some of them strategic. But if you just look at what it actually accomplished, it's not perfect, but it in effect cut 18,000 taxes on products coming into this country, and it opened more markets to our own products. But as important, maybe more important, it raised, not as high as you might like, but it raised standards for protecting workers, for protecting the environment, for safeguarding intellectual property, for creating transparency. And this comes back to the point I was making earlier. Could the agreement have been better? Could it have been more progressive? Sure. But by nature, when you're getting 11 or 12 countries together, you're not going to get everything. And what I can tell you is this: in the absence of the United States driving that agreement, those standards being driven by, say, China, would have been far lower. So I know people feel incredibly frustrated, and there's a desire for really breaking a little bit of crockery right now, and I get it. I'm more of an incrementalist, and I believe we can actually do it working incrementally. But right now, there is so much molasses in the works in Washington that having your voices heard, is more important than ever. And it may be that things are only really going to change from the ground up.
Yeah, I appreciate the answer. The only piece that I didn't hear is just like, how do we get people excited? And TPP was even a particularly good example of where nobody got excited about it.
It's hard to get excited about a trade agreement. Look, I don't know about you all, but I think the excitement's there. You go around the country now, you see extraordinary people actually running for public office, which is kind of a sea change because for good reason people got a little bit frustrated with politics. I can tell you the folks I know who are running for office now are among the most impressive people I've ever met. And I hope that you actually get a new generation of folks who say, you know, things have to change. I'm not going to sit back and complain. I'm actually going to get involved and do something. That's the important thing.
Hello, Mr. Blinken. My
Good
name
evening.
is Caden Rivers. I've just got a couple of things to say, and you're a pretty smart dude, so I thought maybe...
This sounds like a setup.
It's not a trap, I swear. Not really. So I want to hear your thoughts on a couple of things. So obviously social and political issues and intrigues are pretty intertwined. In fact, they're often interchangeable. So from what I've noticed, we've seen our prided multi-inclusive diversity in this country kind of fall into a bit of a harmful edge, I think, and let me explain. I have less of a statement than a question also, it's worth mentioning. I've found that it has perhaps become too vast, and I begin to see distinct identities become so profound that groups kind of become cults, and diversity has begun to cool into a form of tribalism. And I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned tribes before, because I had come to a very similar conclusion. So I believe that this sort of hostile belonging that we've come into is one of the major resisting factors in becoming national bridge builders, as you called it, in general. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, if you verify it, if you agree with that, and how can we prevent that?
Yeah, look, I think you put your finger on something very important. And there's some really interesting literature that's out there now on this new tribalism phenomenon. Amy Chua, in the news for other things recently, has an interesting book on that. Francis Fukuyama, the famous End of History academic, has a very interesting book as well on this new tribalism. And, you know, I think there are, again, a lot of reasons for it. And I tried to analyze a little bit of it, at least from my vantage point. But so much of this has to do with one of the profound paradoxes of our time, at least where I see it, which is this. The single biggest change that I felt in working in Washington for 25 years was the flow of information. Nothing had a greater impact. When I started working in Washington, if you were working in the White House in the early 1990s, basically everyone did the same two things every day. You got up in the morning, you opened the front door of your apartment or your house, and you picked up a hard copy of the New York Times or the Washington Post or maybe the Wall Street Journal. And then at 6:30 in the evening, if you had a television in your office, you turned it on and you watched the National Evening Network News, CBS, NBC, ABC. Everyone had for better or worse, a common basis of facts from which to work. You could develop very different judgments about what to do based on those facts, but there was a common denominator. What we've seen in the years since is what should be, on one level, a profoundly positive thing, which is a massive democratization of information. The information then was controlled or shaped or purveyed by a relatively small number of institutions. Now, everyone's in the news business. And those of us brought up reading John Stuart Mill in college thought, well, that's kind of the way the world's supposed to work. The more information, the better. Ideas will rise, they'll compete with each other, the best ideas will succeed. But of course, we know the world hasn't quite turned out that way. And one of the huge problems we have is something that all of you are very familiar with, which is just this extraordinary siloing of information, so that some of us get our information from one place, others from another, and never the twain shall meet. And it's pretty hard to have a rational discourse when you don't even have a common basis of facts from which to talk. And that feeds, in turn, and adds fuel to this kind of extreme tribalism. Everyone simply wants to have their own pre-existing opinions reinforced. And it's really, really hard to break out of that and to try to open your mind to something different, to have those hard conversations. So, look, I don't have any brilliant answers. I'm kind of admiring the phenomenon. It's real. It's palpable. But I'd say this as well. You know, as challenging as this moment feels, we've been through arguably a lot worse in our history. Those of us, I was a kid, but I have a distant memory of it. But those of us who were adults in the 1960s remember 1968, when the entire country seemed to be falling apart. The assassination of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and then Kent State. It all seemed to be tumbling down, and different communities were pitted at each other in literally violent ways. And we got through that. And one of the reasons we got through it is something I mentioned earlier, which is that people decided to get involved and said, this is not the country we know or we want. And they helped change things. So that's the best I can offer, is make sure that your voice is out there, get involved, speak up, speak out.
Oh, one more thing. Just one more thing. Out of curiosity, what does your schedule look like for the rest of the day? I really think that we should. I don't know, there's a diner nearby, and I've been looking for an excuse to go there, so if you're interested, you know, hit me up.
Talk to me afterwards.
Oh,
Thank you.
Certainly will.
Yes.
Hi. I think I better start out with a compliment. I really, really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
But now I want to say something.
I knew that was a setup. But
Yeah, no, I was. That was a compliment. No, I did. And your challenges, your solutions all jived with everything I said. But I think you probably, and you did allude to climate change, but I think you maybe underplayed it and its role in affecting all of these challenges that you mentioned in a very dramatic way. And I guess, you know, as a retired ecologist, I probably see the world a little bit differently than somebody from your background. But I don't know what your background is, but I assume
you're right. It's not in the sciences.
Right? Anyway, as I said, in a very simplistic view, my question is, how do you see it going when most scientists understand that climate change is the overriding umbrella that dictates virtually everything we're doing? And it should become fairly obvious, I hope it does, in the next few years. So my question is, I mean, is it going to be a unifying, is it going to bring us together like, say, Nazism did? Or is it going to go the other direction and we're going to be fighting over resources, more specifically water?
Yeah.
Makes sense?
Makes entire sense. I think you're exactly right. And look, in terms of driving many of the problems we're facing right now, you're 100% right. When you have climate change creating massive conflicts over scarcer resources, pitting people against each other, causing migration crises, refugees, we're feeling that here. We know the impact of extraordinary storms and weather events. That's having a very palpable impact. We see it as a driver of so many bad events around the world. I think part of the challenge with climate change has been that the way it was presented in our politics was, you know, we really need to do something about it now because in 20 or 30 or 40 years it's going to be a real problem. And it's very hard to get people motivated, and it sure is hard to get politicians motivated about something that you say is going to happen in 20 or 30 or 40 years. And it was a mistake because, as you so accurately put it, actually the problem is now. It's not in 20 or 30 or 40 years. I thought, you know, we've had these moments. There was the moment when the former Vice President Al Gore seemed to connect with people a little bit on this issue, and then it kind of pulled back. You worry that when it comes to something like climate change, or just to take another example, some of the challenges that we're facing in cyberspace and the misuse of cyberspace in a whole series of ways, that things only really change when you get a titanic moment. That is when you hit the iceberg, which is a pretty terrible thing if you have to wait that long. So a big challenge for folks and for political leaders in particular who understand this and who care about this is how do you motivate people and how do you move people? What really frustrates the heck out of me is that the climate change deniers in our system now probably won't be around to see the full impact of the folly of their views. But all of that said, again, as I said, I'm a little bit more in the incrementalist camp. I think we have to find win-win ways to do this. And when you look at the promise, for example, of all sorts of green technology, it's real, it's powerful, and of course we're ceding it to China. So not real smart. I think there's a powerful argument to be made about how the United States should be leading the world in these technologies and doing good for the environment at the same time. But I agree with you.
You stated at the beginning that tolerance is greater than at any time in American history, then proceeded to show us all the ways that it was not tolerant.
Yeah.
And personally, I felt that even a few years ago, America was far more tolerant. Could you explain why you feel the way you do about now being the greatest time?
Yeah. You know, I was trying to look at it in the aggregate over the sweep of recent history, because you're 100%, 110% right that the episodes of intolerance that we see and feel every day are horrific and powerful. But if you look at where this country is today on LGBT rights, gay rights, et cetera, just to take one example, it's demonstrably better than it was a generation ago, and so on down the line. Now, you can make a case that we've moved backwards when it comes to race relations in this country. But again, in the sweep of the last 30 or 40 years, I still think we're better off today than we were then. So the problem is we have, I think, some real steps forward, but there's always a sort of resistance to that. The interesting thing is there's a powerful piece in the New York Times, I think within the last week, that made a very powerful point, at least in my judgment, and that was that those who are frustrated and angry about some of the things you're talking about and some of the things we've been talking about this evening are called and labeled the resistance, almost self-appropriated as a label, when in fact the real resistance are those who are preventing the progress that has defined this country throughout its history. So, you know, I had the great fortune to spend 8 years working for President Obama, who loved to say that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. And of course, that belief, that conviction is challenged, maybe more now than ever before. And I know a number of us have concluded that it doesn't bend, it's broken. I don't think it is. I still have a conviction that it bends toward justice. But it doesn't happen by itself. It happens by people raising their voices and getting out there and doing things.
Thank you very much.
All right, maybe a couple more.
My name is Sonora Burney. I'm from The Arbiter, which is Boise State's student-run newspaper. So thank you for being here and talking to us. My question stems from the fact that you mentioned how we need to preserve our nation's history while also instituting reform. So I was wondering if you can elaborate how we as citizens, college students, and young people can assist in that. And also, I was wondering how doing lectures like this one, where you get feedback from the audience or the community, has morphed your answer from something that it might have been 20 years ago.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first I'd say doing what you're doing right now is great. I spent most of my college days working on my college newspaper, maybe the best thing I've ever done. So this is a great thing to be doing. And it's actually a really powerful vehicle for change too, because you're helping put daylight on a particular problem or a particular issue. You're helping people understand it, and maybe you're helping to spark a discussion or debate about how to change something that isn't working as well as it should. So that's one great way And you know, people say, oh, well, the journalists are observing things. That's one way of looking at it. But now, more than ever, I think that profession in particular is more important than it's ever been. I think my answers to a lot of things have changed over the last 20 years. And one of the problems in, you know, being in Washington and being in government is that you stay in a bubble. And it's really, really hard to break out of that bubble. And it's why I feel it's so important. One of the reasons I was so happy to be invited here was, as I said, it gets me out of the dreaded East Coast corridor. And again, if we're not having conversations, if we're not listening, if we're not hearing how each of us is experiencing this moment in different ways, then we're just going to stay with our preconceived notions and premises, and we'll be stuck in a rut. So I could probably give you a whole bunch of things where, you know, I thought about something differently, and I changed because I was able to actually spend a little bit of time listening to someone else, not just to myself. So it's a good thing to do. Thank you.
Hi. What do you think about the Navy SEALs building bridges the way they do while they combat terror? And do you have any advice for someone that wants to be a Navy SEAL?
Well, if you want to be a Navy SEAL, it's a pretty extraordinary thing to do. I'm just sort of taking a look, and it looks like you got the basics to start. But no, all kidding aside, you probably know a little something about the program and the training that goes into it. You know, you can't even begin to describe it. My business partner's son got through most of the basic training and somehow survived, and I think they started out with a couple of hundred, and they whittled it down to 7 or 8 in his class, and he made it. And when I heard what he had to go through to get as far as he's gotten, it's beyond the capacity of most of us. But you know, I had the great privilege of working on the Bin Laden operation as a policymaker, and watching as Bill McRaven, who was then the head of our Special Operations Forces, built this operation that got Bin Laden. And I've never been more impressed with anyone in my life. So it's if that's a calling and something that you feel driven to do, and you make it, thank you in advance, because we need folks out there who are defending our freedom in that way every single day. Some of you may not like that, but it's a reality.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'd just like to say thank you for speaking today. It's
Thank
really
you.
important that we get people from all sorts of the government into even secluded areas like Idaho. So I just wanted to know what your opinion would be on a matter of like, how does the isolation of any group affect the formulation and transfer of knowledge between that group and other groups, like say countries or otherwise?
Look, it's basically shooting ourselves in the foot as humanity to do that. No one has a monopoly on the truth. No one has a monopoly on good ideas. No one has a monopoly on how to make us progress as human beings. And so if we're denying ourselves the experience, the knowledge, the ideas, the thoughts of any particular group, that's exactly what we're doing. We're denying ourselves. We're not just holding someone else down, we're actually holding ourselves back. So we have to find ways to, again, break down some of these barriers and build some of these bridges. When I worked for President Clinton back in the 90s, we would go around the world and meet with people who were working on one problem or another. Maybe it was a climate-related problem, maybe it was health, maybe it was energy. And you'd hear from people halfway around the world some remarkable solution they'd found to a problem that was bedeviling us. And President Clinton used to say, the real trick is the ideas are there. They're all over the world. The question is, how do we actually share them and make sure that people are talking to each other? So that's a huge challenge. It's incredibly important. To do the opposite is just holding ourselves back. So, breaking down those barriers, really, really important. Thank you. Thanks. Hi.
Hi, I would like to preface my question by saying it is political in nature, but I am going to use an example.
Okay.
There are many others, but it's political in nature and not religious. I'm interested in how our foreign policy affects human rights and social justice around the world. How do we deal with political systems like Zionism, which have justified itself upon past atrocities, but now perpetuate atrocities on others by that justification, which essentially our foreign policy has given it? We build alliances based on what is best for us, perhaps security, and kind of damn another group of people to suffer for that cause. What could and should be done to provide some justice for those who suffer for our security?
Okay. Thank you. You know, as we were talking about a little bit earlier, and as I was trying to acknowledge, albeit imperfectly, as good as I think we've gotten the big picture since World War II, there are all too many examples where, on a regular basis, we fall short of the ideals that we say we espouse and that we're driving toward. I mentioned the profound inconsistency in our policy and the way we approach, for example, authoritarian regimes. During the Cold War, if they were aligned with us, we gave them a pass. If they were aligned with the Soviets, we went at them. And same today, there are dictators that we like because they're aligned with some of our other interests, and those that we don't like because they're not, and that's profoundly inconsistent. And you can do one of two things. You can either rectify the inconsistency by having a totally consistent foreign policy, or at least you can start by acknowledging that you're inconsistent and that maybe there's some other interest that you find, at least in the near term, more important. But at the end of the day, my own view is that aligning ourselves with others who are in the business of keeping someone else down is probably going to rebound against us at some point. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but at some point in the future. The problem is, what do you do about it? And here's where there's a real, legitimate, I think, argument where people of very good faith can simply disagree. Let's take the case of, say, relations with a country like Egypt. We sell them a lot of arms. We support their military. And some people say that given the human rights abuses that happen in Egypt, and this is just one example, I could pick many, we should cut them off. We should deny them the arms, and we should pull back from the relationship. And that's a very powerful and legitimate point of view. There are others who say, well, okay, we can do that, but what's going to happen? Someone else will take our place. When we sell weapons, whether we like that or not, we at least supposedly put conditions on their use that others don't. And so we're going to wind up with a worse situation if we get out and someone else does it, and we're not at least trying, because we have a relationship, to influence them slowly to move in a better direction. It's an argument you've seen repeat itself again and again and again in country after country. And my own experience has been, you really can make an argument on both sides in both directions. And you have to just reconcile yourself to whatever side you're taking in that debate. But your basic proposition, I think, is right. It's hard to sustain, keeping someone else down. Eventually, something is going to happen. And if you're seen as being a party to that, you're probably going to feel it too. A good case right now is Yemen, and this is a great example of that same dilemma. And I was in government at the time. There's been as you know, a big civil war going on in Yemen for some time. We were making massive efforts through the United Nations, to bring the conflicting parties together. We were making some progress. And then at one point, one of the groups involved, the Houthis, decided to go on the offensive. They took over the capital, Sana'a. They were moving on the whole country. And we thought, well, this actually is not a good thing. It can't stand, because it's actually disrupting all of the efforts we were making to try to create a more peaceful transition of power. And so the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others stood against it. And we said, okay, we have to stand with them and push this back. The purpose of doing that was to convince the Houthis to come back to the table, to negotiate, to get back into this UN framework that we'd put on the table to try to get to an agreement. It wasn't to perpetrate indiscriminate civilian casualties on the population of Yemen. And so now we're stuck in a place where we're seen as complicit in these horrific casualties that are taking place because our partners, Saudis, Emiratis, are much too lenient in their willingness to actually avoid those casualties. So you get these kind of dilemmas all the time. And you can take a sort of pure view and just say, I am not dealing with anyone who does X, Y, or Z. And maybe that's the right thing to do, or maybe it's the wrong thing to do because whatever influence you might have in moving them in a better direction is gone. So I don't have a good answer for you. I can tell you that it was one of the hardest things that I had to deal with in trying to help think of what our policies should be. And of course, last thing I'll say on this is this. Most of these situations, not all of them, but most of them are always a little bit more complicated in some ways than they seem. And what looks black or white from one perspective may really have a lot of shades of gray. So you really have to get into some of the detail. And finally, this. I think we have to have a huge amount of humility as well. Most of the problems that we see around the world are actually not about us. And many of them, most of them even predate the existence of our country. So the idea that we can come in and flip a switch and solve it is simply wrong. On the other hand, a lot of these problems affect us, even if they're not about us. And, at least until recently, we've had an ability to mobilize other countries in common action greater than any other country in the world. If we abdicate that responsibility, we're not doing the world a service, and I don't think we're doing ourselves a service either. Thank you.
So you spoke quite a bit on the idea of isolationism and how isolationism prevents us from learning from our past mistakes, such as in World War I. After World War I, we kind of continued this isolationism, which led to World War II. And I was wondering how you would suggest that the United States, or more importantly, international organizations such as the United Nations, would combat this kind of intrinsically human notion of categorizing us and them and creating a more cohesive international community.
Yeah. It may be the biggest challenge that we face. I think it just begins with this recognition that I tried to talk about a little, that virtually every really big problem that we have to contend with and hopefully solve defies a unilateral or isolationist solution. It simply can't be done. And you just have to make it, I think, real for people. If something that seems to be happening or starting halfway around the world can come and whack you in Boise, Idaho, then you'll come to the conclusion pretty quickly that we need to find some cooperative solutions to deal with it, or we just need to exert a lot of U.S. force, which has plenty of downsides, to fix it too. Take the opioid crisis. I mentioned that briefly before. So 95% of the heroin that comes into this country comes from Mexico, and most of the synthetic opioids, fentanyl, now comes from China. So by definition, we have to figure out some way of working more effectively with our neighbors in Mexico and the Chinese to deal with this problem. Now they're going to say to us, well, you need to do something about the huge demand, and you need to do something more effective about treating people. And there's a bargain to be had there. And of course, they'll probably also say to us, maybe you should stop hitting us over the head with a 2x4 on some of this trade stuff. But again, maybe I'm thinking about it in a sense too logically, but it really is just sort of talking through, what are the really big things out there? What have we been concerned about in terms of our security, in terms of our prosperity, in terms of our well-being? And as we think about that, can we think of a way to solve that problem by putting ourselves into a cocoon? And if we can, okay. I just don't see it. So sort of talking and walking through that, I think, is a place to start.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you.
Please join me again in thanking former Deputy Secretary of State Anthony Blinken.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Have a good night.